Hi, this is Tony Szturn. Greetings from Winnipeg. It's a pleasure to be here and present to the group in McMaster and the SMAP group. I guess other universities are involved, not just McMaster. Now, I have a visual impairment, so I do require text-to-speech software. So anytime someone comes on or leaves the meeting, the voice software will voice their name. It's not meant to embarrass anyone. It's just that I need the voice on in order to deal with a computer display. So not a problem. So you might hear a female voice once in a while. That's my voice. So what we're going to go. I'm just going to advance the slide. So I just want to say that there's a number of people involved in this research. The research involves multiple pathologies, older adults. It involves Parkinson's. It also involves TBI. It also involves stroke, people with vestibular disorders, and people with concussion. So the platform that we developed that looks at neurofitness encompasses a number of pathologies. Why is that? Well, all those pathologies have problems with balance, gait, visual motor problems, and fall issues or mobility limitations. And some of them have cognitive problems as well. So this is a group effort. Dr. Ko is one of my co-PIs on a number of the projects. He is our PET MRI expert. Dr. Hobson is the neurologist, head of the Movement Disorders Clinic for Parkinson here in Manitoba. And the other individuals that you see there are graduate students, either in the College of Rehab Sciences or in the Human Anatomy and Cell Sciences with Dr. Ko. Okay, so next slide. Oops, sorry. Okay, so the objectives of this study, there's really 4 objectives here. One is to look at really what mobility is and bring in the cognition into mobility. And the second objective is to look at neurofitness from a behavioral perspective, what's required for real life activities, instrumental activities, shopping, leisure activities, sport activities, etc., for people with problems. And then the last 2 objectives, we'll look at pilot studies that we've done with 2 patient population, 2 groups of individuals, one older adults age 75 plus with balance problems and high fall risk, and 2 with a group of Parkinson patients with mobility problems and cognitive problems. So again, mobility functions in general require a good cardiovascular fitness capability, a good musculoskeletal fitness capability. These are all very important to mobility. And there's no question, and there's a lot of information that we have in these areas. The focus of my research is more on what I call neurofitness. And neurofitness, the brain functions for mobility. There are a number of things domains you have to look at. Balance, stability is a domain that you have to look at. Locomotion, motor coordination are skills that are very important. Visual motor skills are very important too, and as are executive cognitive functions. And typically in behavior and community ambulation, we're doing all these things at once. So there is brain work in many different regions of the brain during real behavior. Those brain regions, some of them are related to pure motor, some of them are sensory, some of them are attentional, some of them are cognitive processing, etc. Something has to organize, coordinate that brain work during behaviors, and which leads to this issue of dual tasking, etc. Just hold on here. I gotta find when I go close to the computer, I have to find the button that allows me to advance. Okay, so what about this issue of cognition and mobility? Well, really walking, community ambulation, running, jumping, playing sports, doing instrumental activities of daily living. Mobility is a cognitive function. It's not a simple function. It requires the organization of all sensory inputs. So transformations alignment of sensory information from the vestibular system, the visual system, the tactile system, and the proprioceptive system. It also involves planning. It involves feed-forward control. You have to navigate through the environment. You have to interact with the environment. That requires visual search, visual tracking, process of what is being seen, looking for obstacles, looking for threat to balance. So again, any mobility activity, for example, I'll use the term community ambulation, is going to require for you to do brain work in multiple regions, in the frontal cortex, in the temporal cortex, in the visual cortex, in the parietal cortex, both sides of the brain. You need feed-forward control, and of course, you're going to make errors. You're going to come up. You're going to get situations where you will have sudden or unexpected perturbations. So you need a really good feedback control system to deal with the unexpected and to deal with movement errors. So there's lots happening during community ambulation, and of course, all these the brain work in the different regions. Something has to orchestrate it. So we need a supervisory control system. So the frontal cortex not just do executive control functions. It also is our orchestrator, supervising. Knowing when to bring in the temporal lobe, knowing when to bring in the parietal lobe, knowing when to bring in vestibular information, knowing when to bring in feedback control, etc. All these functions, again, are complex, cortical, voluntary willed functions. So mobility really requires cognition for a lot of different aspects of what we want to do with our mobility behavior. So what is executive cognitive function? When we're looking at cognition, or you're looking at the word dementia, dementia is a big word. Balance is a big word too. It has a lot of aspects to balance, but dementia and cognition are big words. Dementia in very general terms can be broken down into two domains: a memory domain, so long-term memory, something that you would associate with Alzheimer's disease, and executive cognitive function, something that you would associate with a frontal cortex and a visual cognitive impairment, cognitive impairments that you might see in Parkinson or stroke patients. Not easy to define what executive cognitive function is or what the frontal cortex does. Not so simple, but in general terms, I list a number of the more common domains or elements of executive function that we often see in neuropsychological tests of executive function. Information processing speed is sort of a general function. It's important really for all aspects of cognition or mobility, especially when you're dual tasking and you need to divide your processing time or your attention to more than one process. And you want each process, you need to go from one process to another process for set shifting, task shifts, etc. For looking at distractors, for choice, etc. You need to process quickly so you can identify what's good, what's bad, what needs to be done. Distraction is another main, or cognitive inhibition is another main executive function. Our nervous system is getting tons of information at any moment in time. We need to direct our attention to things that are behaviorally significant, that are important to us for that particular moment and for that particular goal, what you want to do at that point in time. So lots of executive cognitive processing going on. This is mainly a function of the frontal cortex. Working memory is another big executive cognitive function. We often need to put things into a provisional memory for a very short period of time, and we'll come back to it when we need it. Oftentimes, a lot of these executive functions will require us to access and recall long-term memory. We have a lot of experience. We've seen a lot of things over our lifetime, and we've created strategies to deal with what might seem to be novel situations. They're really not. So we need experiences. We need to take advantage of our experiences when we're processing moment-to-moment executive functions. So recalling memory is an important part of executive cognitive function. Now here I bring this up. I'm going to take a step sideways or backwards. Here is your MOCA, your mini mental test. These are the elements. These are the different types of cognitive functions that you would test in the mini mental test, or in most people use the MOCA. You can see here that this test is not a pure test of long-term memory. It's not a pure test of executive function. It's not a pure test of attention. There's some, and it's not, and in fact, it has some tests of our affective state, or psychological, psychiatric aspect to behavior in the limbic system. So this has a few items related to attention, a few items related to memory, a few items related to executive function, a few items related to language and math aspects. Some are verbal cognitive functions, some are visual cognitive functions. So lots going on in this test. So it's a lot of people use this to say, oh, we have dementia. Well, yeah, but what kind are we talking about? I think we need to be more specific in what parts of the brain are processing the things we want to look at, and not just simply use the word dementia or cognition. Okay, now there's the evidence is growing that dual task analysis, assessment, screening, treatment is becoming very important for a number of patient populations. For older people, they have mobility problems, but they also have executive cognitive problems and memory problems. Parkinson patients, again, many of them have problems in both the gait balance domains and the executive cognitive domains. Same with stroke, same with TBI. So we need to look at how mobility problems and cognitive impairments interact with each other in terms of fall risk, fall prevention. Okay, and we now know that if you provide multi-component dual task training programs, you can get results in terms of improved balance, improved gait function, decreased fall risk, improved cognitive function, and critically improved dual task function. Because again, in real life, participation requires you to do multiple things at once. So community ambulation is going to require you to navigate, to interact with the environment, to have good gaze control so you can search and track visual information, so you can process what is being seen, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so let's talk about our dual task platform. This is, I'm not hearing anybody laugh at this slide, I'm just kidding. This is a slide I saw many, many years back, maybe 15 years back, and it really encapsulates what we have developed over these last 15 years in terms of dual task control. The ability to interact, integrate, blend multiple aspects of behavior, balance, gait, arm motor control, cognitive control, visual, et cetera, et cetera. So the reality of our system really isn't too far away from this. So here we have what we've developed. And the short version of this is that we use a computer mouse to interact with digital media. We use digital media as a source of cognitive content. And we use a treadmill to provide you with controlled, to deal with physical demands of walking. Treadmill is good because it has a number of safety features. So we can challenge you on a treadmill. We can challenge your walking speed, your balance. With the display, we can challenge and provide you with many different levels and types of information processing loads. So physical demands, cognitive demands, and at the same time, using handrails, using a bodyweight support system, we can ensure your safety. Well, we're challenging your mobility, your balance, your gait, and your visual motor system and your cognitive system, and then blending it all together. So we can look at balance individually or gait individually, visual motor or gaze control individually, cognition individually, or we can blend them together. Okay. We use digital media because digital media allows us to, so digital media, we use computer games. Computer games that are fun, that will help engage you in therapy. So therapy time goes quicker and you're more likely to come back to therapy. So computer games is a motivational component that we incorporate into our platform. Now there's lots and lots and lots of different types of computer games that have all kinds of different executive cognitive functions and visual motor control functions and optokinetic functions, which we'll talk about in a bit. So digital media is a great source. We're using vision to absorb large amounts of information in a very short period of time. So through this computer games, through this digital media, we can send a lot of information in a very short period of time to the brain for the brain to process cognitively, executive cognitive functions while you're balancing or while you're walking. And we can set the balance cost, the level of balance demand, or the treadmill speed, the level of walking demand to very low levels or very high levels. We can set the cognitive games to being very simple or being more complex. So again, vision, the bandwidth of vision is very great, much greater than 5G, probably about 15G. So we can get lots of information in the brain, get you to process it. But it's one thing to give you information and say, process it. It's another thing to know if you do process it and how well you process it. So we need a method to interact with the computer games. So we give you information and we want to see a response. So in 1 or 2 seconds, we'll give you information. And in that 1 or 2 seconds, we want to see a response to see if you process that information and how well you process that information. So we do, and it needs to be hands-free because you've got to look at the safety features, the handrail features, etc. So we developed, or we found, and we helped develop this inertial-based computer mouse. So basically a gyroscope, a 2 degree of freedom gyroscope. It's miniature, it's wireless, and it's plug and play. Very important, plug and play, so that we can play any computer game. We don't have to develop proprietary computer games for our treatment program. We can use whatever's out there. There's lots of computer games that are good. There's cheap, inexpensive websites that allow all kinds of arcade-style games. There's dedicated proprietary cognitive websites like Luminosity, Happy Neuron, Sharp Brains, Neuronation that have all kinds of dedicated executive or visual attention type cognitive content. And lo and behold, some of those websites actually have computer games, not just what I call flashcard type cognitive applications where you say, okay, how many dots do you see? What's the order of the dots? What's the color of the dots? Where are the dots located? They're actually computer games. So they're fun. Motivation, engagement, again, is an important part of this, this package. Okay. So getting back to the IB mouse we put on the head. It's a gyro, so it's a good device. It takes angular velocity and integrates it to produce instantaneous angular position with very little drift. So the middleware and the firmware of this device is great, very important if you want to interact with high responsiveness and high fidelity with common computer games. You have to be responsive and you have to have pixel level control. So you have to have high fidelity. And that's what this mouse has. It's equivalent to any optical computer mouse. And again, it's plug and play, no drivers needed. You plug it in and you can play any computer game. And it's drift free because you're using the mouse, you're using your head rotation. So head pointing movements control the game sprite or the game pad. So you see the game objects, you interact with these game objects by using head pointing movements. Now, during a day, we move our head to change the gaze, the eye position, thousands of times a day. So our ability to look at things, shopping, recreation, sports, we do tons and tons of head pointing movements. So we're really good at moving our head to direct our gaze to very specific points. So we get foveation of very small objects. It does not take long to teach someone how to use the head-mounted mouse and to deal with a little bit of drift. So here we have a mouse, we have a computer game, and we have a treadmill, and that's the platform. We do both the balance assessment and gait and balance treatment on the treadmill because it has the safety features. It's got the handrails, it's got the support system, etc. So we do both our dual task balance screening and treatment and our dual task gait screening or assessment and treatment in the same system. Now, this system was developed for treatment, so we're treating people, and at the same time, we've embedded assessment into treatment. So then when they're doing their treatment, we have a full assessment capability to look at their visual motor control, their cognitive control, their balance control, their gait function, and their dual task function. We developed some software. I call it the RTP gaming system. It has a couple of modules. This is the first module. This is our visual motor tracking module. It's very simple. We have a circle, a circular cursor. It's computer controlled. It moves left to right or up and down at a fixed frequency and a fixed amplitude. That's configurable. We have a rectangle. The rectangle is slave. The rectangle is slave to the IB mouse, so head rotation moves the rectangle. The goal is to overlap. The goal is to overlap the rectangle on the cursor. So what we're doing here is we're forcing you to foveate on a moving target. That's moving left to right, up or down. It can be a predictable movement or it can be a random movement. So we're forcing you to foveate while we're producing active head rotation. Now, if we put you on a treadmill and do this, we also include passive head movement. So this task requires all aspects of gaze function, smooth pursuit, saccade, and VOR. And we can look at them individually or in combination. Now we record, while the game is playing, we record the coordinates of the cursor and the rectangle at 100 Hertz, and you can see the bottom plot. The pure sinusoid is the computer. That's what you're supposed to do. The other plot trajectory is the person. So looking at the difference between those two plots and the frequency analysis, etc., we can look at how well your visual motor or gaze function is. Now we can do this in sitting, we can do this in standing on a sponge or where there's an increased balance cost, and we can do this while walking on a treadmill. So we can see the difference between single task sitting versus dual task balance versus dual task treadmill at a low speed, at a medium speed, at a high speed, etc. So we can get lots of information on this while we're doing exercise. The second module is more of a cognitive module. Again, a simple game. We have an object that appears at one edge of the display, in this case at the top of the display, and it moves downwards. We have a paddle. You control the motion of the paddle with the IB mouse, head pointing movement, and the goal is to catch the target object and avoid the distractor object. So we have some cognitive inhibition happening here. So here, each game event lasts for maybe anywhere from 1.5 seconds to whatever, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. You can have a very slow, a game with very slow movement or very fast movement. You can have the objects very small or very large, the game paddle very small or very large. So you can modulate your speed accuracy relationships. You can have the movements predictable, vertical or diagonal or curved to allow different aspects of of spatial tracking issues. And again, we record the coordinates of the game paddle, and you can see the plot in the bottom right. That's the trajectory of the game paddle. It needs to be at a certain point in time and space to interact with the target object. The structure, the response time, the structure of the trajectory we can use to start grading our performance. And again, you can do this with no distractors. You can do this with 1 or 2 distractors. You can increase the speed accuracy. You can do this in sitting. You can do this in standing on a sponge, which has a certain balance cost or balance demand, and you do this during walking. So you compare performance metrics while you're for this task. And you can use this task for exercise, or you can use this task for screening. Now, what about the balance performance while you're doing the system? So this is our balance training system. We often use dual task balance as our warm-up. Most people can do this more or less. There are some patient populations that can't do this yet, so it takes a while. This would be a training program, not just a warm-up. So how do we measure balance while you're doing the exercise, or how do we screen balance performance? Well, we have a pressure map. You see the pressure map in the middle, and you can see the feet on the pressure mat. From the pressure mat and the pressures that we see on the feet, we can compute the center foot pressure, which you see on the right plots. So over a 30-second time period, you see XY plot of APML COP displacement. From the COP displacement plots, we can quantify different aspects of balance performance. Again, while you're standing on a firm surface versus a compliant surface where there's a balance cost, and while you're performing simple to complex computer games. We put the pressure mat as a thin piece of piezoresistive material that we use, so we can place the pressure mat on top of the sponge and not underneath it. And that, I think, is an important issue. Now, how do we do gait analysis? Well, the same pressure mat we laminate in a tough, a low friction material like Teflon or a plastic, and we just skin the bed of the treadmill underneath the belt with the pressure mat, and we Velcro to the size of the pressure mat. So here you have basically a gait right on a treadmill, and we can pick up all your steps and get a pressure mapping of each step. And we can also, and from that we can record your center foot pressure. You see the plots on the right. The top one is your sort of your standard butterfly. That's 5 consecutive steps, looking at an XY plot of AP versus ML COP. The bottom trace on the right is where we separate your ML COP displacement versus time and your AP COP displacement versus time. And with all this data, we can do a number of things. We can do your standard spatial temporal gait variables, step length, step time, and we can also do a nonlinear dynamical analysis of the COP signal. Entropy, we use sample entropy to do that. We can also use exponents, etc. So there's lots of things we can do, a power spectral density analysis, and harmonic analysis, etc. There's lots of aspects we can look at in terms of gait function. Again, while you're walking at a slow speed, no cognitive load, or when you're walking with cognitive load at low speeds and high speeds. The beauty of the treadmill is that we can control gait speed, so you cannot slow down during the cognitive loads like most people. Overground walking, and you ask someone an older person to walk and text at the same time, they're going to text possibly, but they're going to stop and they're slow down. So they're really not dual tasking. But of course, with this paradigm, the other problem here with this paradigm is that you're controlling the gait speed, you're forcing them to walk, but you can't force someone to do the cognitive task. But you can standardize it. You can give them very specific cognitive information that requires very specific processing, and you will get a response. So you can see if they're actually doing it or not. So again, this is information that we get automatically. This is very unobtrusive method, so that when you're doing your treatment, you can get your assessment, or you can use this as a screening tool. Now, what about the treatment, the cognitive games? Well, the two game modules I showed you run thin. People are not going to do those for long time periods. And those two games only address a very small number of cognitive elements or visual motor elements. So we need another source of cognitive content. And what we do is we use computer games, mostly arcade style computer games. And there's lots and lots of sources of computer games. We've identified at least 80 common computer games that we can easily access, readily available, very inexpensive, that have great content. There's several genres with different executive cognitive functions, and they're fun and they are addicting, not to everybody, but to many people. They're engaging, they're fun. They're not like some of the cognitive, so-called cognitive games that Luminosity ask you to do, or Sharp Brains or Neuronation, the sort of the flashcard type games. Those are good for cognition, but they're not games. They're not engaging that much. Okay, so there's lots of sources here. This is what we use for our treatment program. The one drawback is, of course, is the fact that we can't assess the cognitive part of the equation when we're using these games. So these are good treatment games. We also have to use our RTP game at least once a session to get data on cognitive performance. Now, I'm going to switch and I'm going to go to look at two studies that we did and show you some results that we have. This is our first study. This is a study we did at a Winnipeg community center called the Refit Center. And we were interested in looking at the difference between a task-specific walking program, treadmill walking, versus an aerobic, a cycling program, an aerobic program, both having the identical dual task components to it. So both having the same cognitive game elements in it. We recruited, this was a pilot RCT, so we recruited 22 people from age 75 and above, all had major balance problems. They were attending the refit because they had balance problems, and they were starting to have problems with falls. We did do interviews after the intervention. So the intervention we did a 12-week intervention twice per week. We didn't have any dropouts. We had pretty good in terms of the experiences of the individuals. They were quite good. Many found the program very challenging initially, very challenging, and they had a lot of time doing the game while they were walking. So we had to start off slow. But eventually they became quite good at doing both the walking at a decent treadmill speed and the cognitive games. Interesting, the group, because you know, with ethics, you have to tell both groups what the program is and that they're going to be randomized. And interesting that the recumbent cycling group, a lot of them said, no, they wish they would have had the dual task treadmill program and not just the recumbent cycle program. So here's some of the results. So here's our balance assessment. So we have a standardized time period. We played our visual motor game, and we played our cognitive game over a 30 or 45-second time period, and we looked at balance, their dual task balance, single and dual task balance, and we compared the two groups. We see that both groups had significant improvements in their standing balance under dual task conditions. So their body sway decreased dramatically while standing on a compliant surface, i.e., where we have a significant balance cost to the standing basic support stationary situation. And we did see that the treadmill group did do better So the interaction term, the time star group interaction was significant, and we did see a greater improvement in balance performance in the treadmill group than in the recumbent cycle group. But the recumbent cycle group did significantly improve their balance performance over the study. Now, in terms of gait, dual task gait function, again, treadmill, visual motor task, cognitive task. We looked at the various spatial temporal gait variables. We only saw a group effect in the treadmill group. We did not see any improvement in step length, average step length, or average step time, or step variation in the recumbent cycle group. Only we saw improvements in these parameters in the treadmill group. Now, the treadmill, I guess I should say that the treadmill assessment was done for 1 minute. So we captured approximately 60 steps, 30 right, 30 left steps for our analysis. So the analysis was based on the average of 30 right and 30 left steps and the coefficient of variation of the same number of steps. Interestingly, when we just looked at the visual motor performance, we see that both groups improved and there was no difference in that improvement. So the time star group interaction was not significant. Same thing with our cognitive gain. When we look at success rate and other measures of the cognitive gain that we use, we see that both groups did improve significantly, but there wasn't a difference in how much one group improved over the other group. We also did some neuropsych testing. We did the animal enumeration and visual search test. And then we did the trail making test. We did not see any change in the groups for the verbal fluency test, but we did see significant changes in the trail making test, especially in trail making test B. So we had good results with that study. And I think we're in a position to go to a multi-center study with that aging group, which we're in the process of planning. Now, we also have done a similar study, basically, with Parkinson patients. So we did 15 Parkinson patients. This one was more just a pilot study. It did not have a control group. So we looked at 15 Parkinson patients, some stage 2, some stage 3, and we gave them the dual task training program. Again, the dual task balance as their warm-up and the dual task treadmill program for their treatment. We did 12 weeks, twice per week. Each session lasted about 40 minutes. And again, we interviewed them. So we did a qualitative analysis. The experiences were very good. Again, they liked the fact that there was lots of different games to play and then had variety. That was important to them. Again, very challenging initially, but they did get used to it. And we didn't have any dropouts. Now, in terms of balance and gait improvements, we did see significant improvements in balance and gait, and we did see significant improvements in their visual motor function, and we did see significant improvements in their cognitive function. Now, the treatment did not include the visual motor game, or it did not include the cognitive game. The treatment only included the commercial arcade games. Now, the other, I guess I should say, the program that we have is an interval program. So we set up the program in 2 to 3 or 4 minute intervals. So they're going to do a balance session of, say, 2 minutes while playing one computer game for 2 minutes. And they're going to do the treadmill walking in intervals of 2 to 3 minutes. So we have to find, and so they walk at a certain speed and play a computer game for 2 to 3 minutes. And then we increase the speed, and we increase the information processing load by changing the game or by increasing the speed accuracy relationships or other components of the computer game. So basically, it's an interval type approach that we use. And games are played for 2 to 3 minutes. And that's another reason why we choose the more arcade style computer games. They're easy to start, they're easy to understand, And they can be fun for most people, see them as fun. And they do have good cognitive content to them. So you are doing visual tracking, you're doing foveation, you're moving your head, you're processing information, etc. So conclusion for those studies, I think we have results that that allow us, I think, to or justify the move to a multi-center, fully powered RCT. So we have now received funding to do an RCT with the Parkinson patients using our dual task treadmill program. And thankfully, and we've also included in the study PET imaging. So we're going to use functional PET imaging as one of our outcome measures. What is PET imaging? Well, this allows us to image the brain while they're walking or while they're dual task walking. So the procedure is we inject some radioactive isotope glucose into the individual. We have a 25-30 minute uptake period. The uptake period is not a resting uptake period. It's actually a treadmill walking. So we actually get them to treadmill walk for 30 minutes, and then we get them to, in a separate session, we'll get them to do dual task treadmill walking. After the uptake period, they rest for 5 minutes, and then we bring them into the PET scan and we image their brain. So we see what parts of the brain uptook the glucose, what parts of the brain were active during the walking and the treadmill walking. So this allows us to look at areas of the brain that are, and we're doing this with controls, healthy age-matched controls. So we can look at a couple of things. We can see where the problems are in Parkinson patients in terms of walking and dual task walking. And then we can see over the intervention, how did that brain activity change pre to post intervention. So where was the locations of the brain plasticity? Yeah, we have done a pilot study on 5 Parkinson patients during dual task walking. This is some of the results. So we compared the PET images of 5 Parkinson patients who had a 25-minute uptake period of dual task walking to 10 Parkinson patients whose uptake period was arresting. And we do see quite a bit of difference in the metabolic activity between those two groups. We see a lot of activity in the cerebellum. We see a lot of activity, increased activity in the visual cortex, in the sensory motor cortex, in the premotor cortex, in the thalamus. You don't see it here, but we see considerable amount of activity in the brainstem, in particular the superior colliculus and the vestibular nuclei. Interesting, we did not see a lot of activity, increased activity in the prefrontal cortex. That's one interesting finding of this, and we're not sure why. We do know from the near-infrared spectroscopy studies done that individuals with Parkinson's disease, as compared to healthy individuals during dual tasking, they see very limited amount of activity in the prefrontal cortex in the Parkinson patients, whereas in healthy age-matched controls, you see huge amounts of activity in the frontal cortex during dual task walk. Okay, that's all I have to say. So thank you. And I'm here for any questions.
Thank you for that excellent talk. Sorry for the hiccup at the very beginning.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
So if anyone has any questions, just feel free to unmute your mic. If I have trouble doing that, you can type in the question in the chat. I will relay that to Tony. Always a moment of silence right after a talk.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Dylan, please go ahead.
Hey, great talk. Thanks for that. I have a ton of questions. I think it's really interesting stuff. I'll try to kind of just put a couple out there, but just as you finished, showing those examples, those were in Parkinson's disease, I think you said, right? Those five pilot trials that you had?
That's the average. Yeah, those were the average of 5 versus the average of 10. So the average of 5 who did dual task walking versus the average of 10 who did resting. And that's a different threshold levels. What you saw there was the lateral and the medial view for different cluster sizes and different threshold sizes. Okay. So those are the averages, and then a t-test, doing paired t-tests on the voxel sizes that we developed. Everything was fMRI masked. There is an article out in neuroimaging. I did send a group of articles to my abstract. The information for that is detailed in our publication in Neuroimage, Journal of Neuroimaging.
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting, that piece, and as well kind of the stuff that you're going forward with the PET scan, because, you know, when we're thinking of this dual tasking, the executive function and then the controlling of gait, I don't think there's a lot of work in that space in terms of exactly detailing where that is, or I don't maybe know as much of it, but I think it's really interesting. And the fact that there's no prefrontal or very little prefrontal in that sort of those last 5 examples there you had, I think is really, really interesting. And you said you're not really sure why. So I don't know if you can kind of speculate on perhaps some rationale of why that might be.
Well, there's two bits of information we have. I didn't show you the next slide of the imaging. So those 5 PD clients, 2 of them were stage 1, stage 2, and 3 of them were stage 3. Okay. So when you look at the individual people, the stage 1, stage 2 had quite a bit of increased frontal cortex activity relative to the resting, whereas the stage 3 did not at all. So of the 5, when you group the 5 together, we don't see much statistical difference between the PD and the dual task walking and the resting. And our probability levels are set pretty high at 0.001 because we're doing tons and tons of t-tests, right?
Yeah.
On hundreds and hundreds of voxels.
Yeah, and so I guess the other thing that I think kind of broadly relates to sort of the dual tasking literature and things like that I always have trouble with is, you know, there's a bunch of different tasks that we can do, and I love the fact that you're kind of doing some more you know, exciting and interactive activities, I guess, rather than like serial 7s or like remembering words and things like that. But in terms of evaluating the success on both sides, that's always a tough part for me, because a lot of times when we think of dual tasking, in my area anyways, we're looking at gait and we look at the changes in gait and all that kind of stuff, and then we forget about how successful they were in that actual dual tasking event. And is that something that you can kind of get at with the Parkinson's disease aspect of it? Like, are they successfully accomplishing that dual task, or are they focusing on one or the other, and how do you kind of balance that?
Well, you can't measure whether or not they're paying attention to the cognitive task. I mean, you just can't measure that to know explicitly without any doubt whether or not they're dual tasking. You can't. You can give them the information. It could be standardized. It could be graded. And then you can ask them for a response. So you can present them information, and you can record what they did with that information. That we can do. Okay, so I can ask you to follow something, and I can see if you followed it. I can ask you to catch targets, and I can see how many you caught in 60 seconds. Now, we play the game for 60 seconds, so there's 30 drops. So there's 30 game events, and we look at the success rate of those 30 game events, and we look at the variation in the plots, and we can look at the response time, and we can look at the amount of movement area of multiple events, not just one event, of 30. And if you do it for 2 minutes, you got 60 events. If you do it for 3 minutes, you got 180 events, etc. So we do multi-event analysis with averaging, but we do record their response. We do record the visual motor response in some detail, and we do record their cognitive response in some detail. At the same time, synchronously, we're recording their gait function, their locomotor rhythm function, their pacing, and their stability.
Yeah, and I think as you said, like all those things are really important. I guess the tricky part with me is how you tie that together across individuals in kind of a full analysis, because I expect inherently some people might do better on the cognitive task and then their gait suffers, and vice versa. Some people do better on their gait and they're suffering on the cognitive task. And I think tying those together, I've always had a really difficult time of like, how can we have that in a final analysis to come from that to have some take home, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense, but you got to remember that we're looking at the cognitive function in sitting under single task conditions, not dual tasking. And then we're looking at the cognitive function while you're balancing. And then we're looking at your cognitive function during dual tasking. So we're looking at the amount of dual task inhibition, the dual task interference that a physical demand of balance produces, of the physical demand of walking produces. So we know what the baseline cognitive is. And again, you can't force that. I mean, for example, in the Parkinson patients, their walking performance is not as good as able-bodied controls. So at baseline, they're not the same. They're different. In older people, the single task walking function or single task balance function is not as good as healthy able-bodied individuals. So they're at a different level at baseline. And then when you add the dual task on top of that, yes, it becomes a problem, but you can definitely see the amount of dual task interference. And you're right. Sometimes they're not going to do the cognitive task and they're going to have a poor performance. Is it because they didn't do it, or is it because the processing was poor?
Yeah, I think it's again, like really
That's right. So you get to look at it in different ways, and you can interpret some things because you have the single and you have the dual.
Yeah.
And you have time. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Now,
I was just going to say, last thing before I kind of pass it on, I don't want to take all the time, but in that instance or across all these, in terms of instruction, I feel like that's an important piece, of which they're focusing. Like, are you instructing them to fully focus on the task, the cognitive task?
No, we just say, here, do these. I want you to do, again, we start in sitting and we get them to do the task in sitting.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we get them to do it in sitting a couple of times so they get used to it. So they know how to use the head mouse, and they know what the game, how to play the game properly. Just like any cognitive, like CANTAP, you would do a series of tests to see if you can use the mouse, right? Before you go in to do your other tests. Any computerized test is going to do that. So yes, they know how to do it. And then you get them to do it during balance. You don't say anything. You just say, okay, now do it, play the game.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Thanks for kind of going through that. I'll pass it on if others have questions. I don't want to take all the time.
Any other question from the audience? I do have a follow-up question regarding the dual task. Not all games are created equal. So do you see, is there a quantitative measure in terms of the amount of mental effort or cognition involved in those games, and their relationship with the effectiveness of the training outcome?
Yes, and it requires some experience. It requires you playing around. I mean, like, for example, Aquaball or a simple brick buster is not that hard to play. Jet Jumper is much more difficult to play. It requires more components to the cognitive elements. And you see these, and you see you watch them play the game, and you can see if they're struggling playing the game. It's simple. It's in Vista Color. You see it. They see it. You see it. And you also see what how much balance sway they have. And you also see how much drift they have. And you also see them stumbling. And you see how they change their gait. So you can see how a game affects their balance and their gait at any one speed. In some games, they can't walk. They can't do it. So therefore, you have to do a couple of things. You have to reduce the gate speed, or give them more warm up on the sponge, or get them to play the computer game a little bit better. Yeah, well, yeah. There's multiple physical and cognitive loads here that you can grade, and you have to take a systematic approach to it.
Right, but if you were to make a recommendation, like say you have a number of games that can be utilized, how would you decide like what is likely to be most effective?
If I'm not seeing their gait being challenged, or if I'm seeing them playing the game really, really well, it's time to move on. Okay, I'm a physiotherapist. If I see you lifting a weight and you can do it easy, and I'm not seeing any muscle stiffness or lactic acid pain with that weight, I'm going to increase the weight. And that's basically what we do. Everything is an interval process. You get them to do something, and you have to observe how that affects them from a balance and gait perspective. And you get to see how, if it's not cognitively demanding, they're going to play that game very well. It's easy to them. That's simple to see, and you just move on. You move on to another genre, or you increase the speed accuracy relationship, or add some other element to the computer game.
I see.
So it's very important to have a large repertoire of games in order to be able to do that. And some people don't like certain games. They hate them. And they like other games, and some games are addicting. So there's the personal preference aspect to games as well. So I think an important thing is to have how you interact with digital media. It's important to be plug and play, so that you can take advantage of what's out there. And there's lots and lots out there. And you need lots and lots for different patient population, different age groups. We do this for cerebral palsy, for young cerebral palsy. We do this for vestibular clients who are young adults, etc. We do it for home, for concussion and vestibular. We have another platform that we use this for hand gaming, for training manual dexterity, for stroke and cerebral palsy. We put the miniature mouse on an object, and we get you to manipulate the object to play the game. So yes, that's very important. And again, the fun part of it, the engaging part of it, is a critical issue as well. Yep.
Right. I think there are a lot of variables here, like one person get familiar with the game, probably the mental effort reduces as well. But I just want to mention, like, I know some of my colleagues are working on computer games. They came up, or there, at least in the literature, there are several metrics that can be used to evaluate like the level of engagement, the level of efforts and things. Maybe there's something that we can say just quantitatively about a particular game.
Yeah, we can do that, and we started that by doing the qualitative analysis, asking the people about what they like and what they didn't like. So we started that process. Yes, there are some objective measures of engagement, but they're subjective. They're not so good, I don't think. Some of them are okay. In terms of commercial games, there's no way of getting objective measures of the performance of those games, because you can't get underneath the game to record it. But you can with our RTP game. That's why we developed the RTP game, so we can systematically change the degrees of difficulty of the game, from a speed perspective, from an accuracy perspective, from a cognitive processing speed and cognitive inhibition perspective, and we can see how that affects their gameplay, and we can see how it affects their balance and their gait. And yes, I'm sorry, it's not my fault that people want to do a lot of things, and that behavior is complex. But yes, that's what, physios, we're used to doing that. That's what we do. There's thousands of variables, and You have to work through them. But there's a starting point, and you do have to challenge the individual, both cognitively, engaging wise, and physical wise. Yes, and you have that capability here. And with experience, you get a good understanding of where to start and how to progress.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Another question is like the current assessment, was it done right after? Like if you see the improvement in balancing or reducing the variability of gaits, was that done immediately after the training session, or perform like a few days after, like whether there's any evaluation of the long-term effect?
Yeah, again, these are pilot studies, and we did not do any long-term testing, for sure not. But in the powered RCT, we will be looking at, no, these were done, 2 or 3 days before the start of the intervention and 2 or 3 days after the intervention. They weren't done on the same days of the intervention. But you're right. Future analysis, any powered RCT needs to take into consideration some of the things you said, a better objective evaluation of engagement, a better objective evaluation of cognitive performance. We would use CANTAB for that purpose. And yes, we have to do testing over long time periods. And again, the other thing I'll say is that, we're treating someone with a Parkinson's disease for 10 weeks. Well, that's peanuts. That's a very small amount of time. These things have to be done for long time periods. So 10 weeks is a very, very short time in the big scheme of improving cognition and mobility. It takes you over a year as a child to learn to walk because of balance. So when you lose your balance or gait capability, it's going to take you a long time to learn. Now, what we've developed here, I believe, is a treadmill workstation with a monitor and a mouse and a game that can go into community centers. That's the whole goal. Transition this to community centers. So this is available to people in the community center. And with the unobtrusive evaluation, we can do fault detection. We can look at performance, balance performance, gait performance, so that we have a fault detection system, so we can make this safe. The beauty of putting it into community centers is that it's cost effective, and many community centers have staff that can provide partial supervision. Mm-hmm. What we do here in Manitoba is we often take stroke clients, Parkinson clients, elderly fathers, and we prescribe them home programs, and we prescribe them community-based programs. And we'll take them to centers like this, and we'll set them up with a prescribed program and interact with the staff so that they can monitor them, and then we'll evaluate them over time.
I see. Yeah, that's very important. Last question from me. Do you see any values of your task in diagnosis, like whether that bring actual source of information compared to testing just mobility by itself, or testing a cognition, like for dementia patients?
Well, there's a huge difference. The amount of dual task interference here. Okay, there's a huge difference between walking function by itself versus walking function and cognition. There's a huge difference, dual task interference, in the cognitive performance when done in sitting versus done during walking. Okay, now behavior requires you to do both. So as a screening tool, independent even if you don't want to do dual task training, say you want to do boxing, or say you want to do aerobics, this is still a really good screening tool.
Mm-hmm. I see.